Times, they are changing. Times, they are changing. Back in 1963, Bob Dylan, considered one of the greatest American songwriters in all time, wrote this song that said, "Times, they are changing." Listen to the lyrics of one of the verses. He says, "Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, because the times, they are changing." Well, folks, now, you look at that, and that was a protest song of the 60s, written from the viewpoint of a young person. But whether you like Bob Dylan or not, and I do for the most part, by the way, I think you would undoubtedly agree with him that times are changing. Times are changing. They were changing in the 60s when he wrote that. They were changing in the 70s when I was in high school. They were changing in the 80s. They were changing in the 90s. And folks, we have had many changes since the turn of the century 24 years ago. They've been changing. Some of those changes would be considered passing fads. Some of those changes are very good. Some of them aren't so good. And some of those changes, such as the internet, are really neither good nor bad, but are what you make out of them. But whatever you see, times are changing. And like it or not, families and our roles have changed, have they not? Families have changed very much so since the 1960s. Roles have greatly changed. In the 1950s and 1960s, when I was a little boy, it was not uncommon for the husband to work and then the wife would stay home. I mean, most of y'all can remember that, can you not? That was just not, it was common. It was very common. That was changing dramatically when Bob Dylan came out with that song, "Times They Are Changing Though." Now, in 2024, it's not uncommon for the wife to be the top breadwinner in the family. And the role of faith, our faith, has changed dramatically. I've cited statistics many times since I've been here, but they talk about this over and over again. It shows how many people have fallen away from the church and that decline of the church's influence. Back in 1964, when Bob Dylan released that song, "Times They Are Changing," over 70% of Americans identified with some kind of religious group, and 49% attended weekly services. Nowadays, less than half of Americans identify with some religious group, and about 20% attend weekly. That should be alarming. But it can also be challenging, because even though times are changing, basic needs have never changed. Family needs have never changed. And today we're on Mother's Day, and I want to talk some about the family. As families, God's intention for us has never changed. As the church, our mission has not changed. And over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be looking at the New Testament book of Ephesians. And we're going to be looking at the family. We're going to be looking at the church. And what we're going to see throughout the book of Ephesians is that great families and great churches reflect each other. Read that with me again. Great families and great churches reflect each other. You know, if you look at the New Testament, the church is often likened to a family. Think about what we call each other, or what Paul called the people of the church. What did he call them? He said, "My brothers, my sisters." That's family. He talked about the church like as a family. And in Ephesians 5, Paul uses the church and the family to illustrate each other. All through the passage we're going to read here in just a minute, you're going to see that. If you think about it, if you want to talk about the church, what's one passage you can go to? Ephesians chapter 5. If you want to talk about the family, where can you go? Ephesians chapter 5, and then the first 4 verses of chapter 6. They illustrate each other. And if you look at that, I want you to look at that passage that we're going to look at this morning, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, and you will see this over and over in this passage. Follow along with me. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with his word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Do you see it? See what I'm saying here? The church and the family are used to illustrate each other all the way through that passage. Our family relationships are built on Christ's sacrifice for his church. And the New Testament model for the family is reflected in the church. And as I said, they reflect each other, they illustrate each other in many different ways. And while we have today set this day aside as Mother's Day, I believe that what the principles that Paul talks about here in Ephesians chapter 5 apply to fathers as well. I believe they apply to all of us. They truly are the principles of the Christian family that reflects Christ and mirrors his church. So I want to give you three principles. The outline's on the back of your bulletin, but follow along with me. The first one is there's no perfection. You know, it's common on Mother's Day and Father's Day to idolize our parents and our families. I mean, that's what we want to remember, isn't it? It's the ideal. We want to idealize our families, even though our families are not perfect. Think about it. Even though Andy Taylor was a widower, what family wouldn't want to be like Mayberry's Taylor family? I mean, that just is considered a great TV show. Who wouldn't want to have a family like Happy Days Cunningham's? How many people would like to have families like that, like those? But folks, you know something? Even though we love those TV shows, the writers correctly pointed out that they were not perfect. How many times did they mess up? One of my favorite Andy Griffith show episodes, one of my favorite Andy Griffith episodes is one in which Andy lost his temper with Opie. And if I tell you about it, you'll probably remember it. Opie, they were having a charity drive at his school, and Opie gave 3 cents to the charity drive. You remember that story? He gave 3 cents, and Andy was furious because he thought he should have at least given 50 cents or something. Remember, this is the early 60s. So 3 cents then was a whole lot more than 3 cents now. But it still wasn't very much. Andy got mad at Opie because he only gave 3 cents to this charity. Do you remember the whole story, the end of that story? Opie only gave 3 cents because he was saving his money for his first grade girlfriend, and he was going to buy her a coat because her parents didn't have enough money to get her one. And if you remember, how did Andy feel at the end of that story? Not that big. So he had problems, did he not? They weren't perfect. How many of you watched Happy Days? That's a much more recent show, and it's still old, but if you watched Happy Days, how many times did you see the Cunningham family with issues? It was often. Many of the punchlines and the stories were around Howard, the father, his weaknesses. But even when they were imperfect, they were a family that loved each other. They were a family, these were families that reflected that nostalgia that we long for, but they were imperfect people, because there is no family on earth that is perfect. Your family is not perfect. My family is not perfect. What was God's intention, though? God's intention was perfection, wasn't it? If you go back to Genesis, you go all there to Genesis chapter 1, you find that God made Adam and he was like nothing else in creation. Look at Genesis chapter 1 and verse 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness. And when he was writing Genesis, Moses here was referring to God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit. There's fellowship in the Trinity. There's fellowship. They weren't alone. And God created man to be like that. You know, you can reason. You have morality. You have all these things. You are a reflection of God in some ways. God said, let's create in our own image. But then look in Genesis chapter 2, when there's more detail about how special man is, and also the creation of woman. Look in Genesis chapter 2, starting in verse 22. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman, and he brought her to the man. Then the man said, this at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh, and she shall be called woman, because she is taken out of a man. Gene Getz, who's a great biblical scholar, preacher, and writer, says that what Adam said here is the equivalent of us just saying, wow. Wow. This is one like me, and no one else like her in creation. And then you go on to verse 24, and you see that complementary nature, what it says. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And if you're saying, well, he's already read that passage before today, that's correct, because Paul quoted this in Ephesians chapter 5 in verse 31. It was a relationship that was created in perfection. That's what God intended our families to be. On Mother's Day, we like to idolize sometimes. But we are imperfect people. We have fallen short of that perfection. Everyone has. Gene Getz went on to talk about that relationship in the garden. He said there was no sin. This is quoting. He said there's no sin. There was no selfishness. They were reflecting the image of God. There was no sin, no sinful behavior, no attitudes, no selfishness. They were reflecting His holiness. They were naked and unashamed. There were no hidden agendas, no secrets. There was total openness, total honesty and openness. But what happened? I've talked about this a lot, but we can never overemphasize what happened. Sin happened. Adam and Eve ate of a fruit that God said not to eat of. The sin was actually what? disobedience. It was disobeying God. That was the sin, and that messed everything up. So regardless of how good we are and how good our families are, we're still all imperfect because of sin. Sin affected our relationship with the Holy God. And it's impacted our relationships with each other, including our marriages and our families. Let me share with something here, folks. I hope that you love your family. But I think everyone here knows that your family's not perfect. And there might be somebody in your family that gives you headaches. Am I correct in that? There might be someone in your family that gives you headaches. Just remember, they're not perfect. Neither are you. You might have a family member whom you are embarrassed because of drunkenness or addiction. Just remember, they're not perfect. They need Jesus, just like you. Divorce or living together in your living together relationships might be going on in your family. It does in many. Just remember, those people are committing sin. They're not perfect. They need Jesus, just like who else? Just like me. Just like you. Your kids might be rebellious. Kids, your parents might not be really caring about Jesus, and that's a sin too. Love them anyway. Remember, they're not perfect. They need Jesus, just like you. So that's the first principle today. There's no perfection. The second, there's mutual submission. Look at what Paul told the Ephesians in Ephesians 5:24 and 25. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Then you go on down to verse 28 where we read, in the same way, husbands should love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. If you go back to verse 21, Paul said that Christian people are to be submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. That's the attitude that every one of us should have in our family relationships, actually in our relationships with each other, all of us. But family relationships should be submitting to one another. It's that attitude of Christ. After all, what are we considered as God's church? We're considered God's family. Submit to one another. That's the attitude that Jesus had. It's the same attitude that Paul wrote about in the book of Philippians in chapter 2, where we read, have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. You see, when Jesus came to earth, he demonstrated that greatest act of submission and humility. What was Jesus' entire ministry about? Serving, forgiveness and serving. He said, I've come to serve. The Son of Man did not come, he came to be served. Or he came to serve, rather. He did not come to be served, but to serve. Sorry about that. As soon as I said that, I said something sounds wrong here. But it said the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve. Jesus came to serve. And Jesus' life of submission and serving, when was that culminated? On the cross. The cross. So, moms and dads, if you want to teach your children about Jesus Christ, what's the first thing you need to do? You need to develop the mind of Christ. Develop that mind of submission. Develop that mind of serving. Because you see, there are God-ordained roles in our family. The husband is to be the head of the house. In the same way, we're told, Jesus is the head of the church. But when Jesus lived a life, He put our needs above His desires. And on the night before He was crucified, what did Jesus say to God? He was praying, Lord, please take this cup from me. But then what did He say? Not my will, but yours be done. Think how much difference we would have in our families if every one of us took that attitude. Not my will, but God's be done. In our world, think about that. How many marriages have teetered on the brink of explosion? How many have actually been blown up by selfish attitudes instead of mutual submission? Folks, if you want an amazing family, live a life of submission, putting others' needs before yours, just like Jesus. Let me repeat that. If you want to have an amazing family, live a life of submission, putting others' needs above yours, just like Jesus. And that leads us to our third principle, a divine reflection. Today's Mother's Day, and in 5 weeks, we're going to be celebrating Father's Day. They're relatively new celebrations, really, when you think about it. The first Mother's Day, according to the research I did, the first Mother's Day was celebrated in 1908. It became a national holiday when President Woodrow Wilson signed the proclamation in 1914. Father's Day was first celebrated in 1910. But it wasn't really a national holiday until President Richard Nixon signed it into law in 1972. But as I said earlier, over the next few weeks, I'm going to be preaching about both the church and the family because they illustrate each other. And we can see that very clearly in Ephesians chapter 5. Look at Ephesians chapter 5, verse 32 and 33. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So he's saying they illustrate each other. Verses 28 through 30, Paul told the Ephesians that the husband takes care of his own body and that the church is members of Christ's body. In other words, we as a church family should do the same that a family does. They take care of each other, just like a great marriage. That's the reflection of a great church. It's when we have that understanding that the church and the family mirror each other and our relationships to each other and our submission to Jesus Christ. I'm going to share something this morning, very personal. And when I thought about this, I went back and forth, debated on it. I don't want to lift myself up in any way. But because of the principles that we've talked about this morning, number one describes me perfectly. And that is, there's no perfection. I'm a very imperfect person. But it was only when I came to understand that my marriage and my church illustrate each other, both became much stronger in my life. I hope it's no secret here that I'm madly in love with my wife. And I would do anything in the world for Stephanie other than break one of God's commands. And you know something? I believe she feels the same way.
Go baby, go baby.
I believe she would do the exact same thing. That doesn't mean we don't have disagreements. It doesn't mean that we sometimes hurt each other inadvertently. Sometimes we have hurts caused by family members. That doesn't mean we always get everything right. But you know something? And you've probably picked up on this. We are always at each other's side. Have you picked that up? We're always at each other's side. I'm her biggest cheerleader. And she's my biggest cheerleader. I'm going to tell you something that I hate to, because I felt it was almost bragging, but it's really not. I want to tell you something that happened in our life. A little over a month ago, I got an email, and it just said in the subject line, "Congratulations." Now, folks, if you check your email every day, how many times do you get something that says congratulations or something like that? And they're saying, "Congratulations, you've been selected to pre-apply for a loan," or something like that. You know, something ridiculous like that. So I almost deleted it. But I saw the address and I said, "This looks okay." So I read the email, and it had a little air of legitimacy about it. And it said, "John, you're going to be honored by the Kentucky Association of Athletic Administrators." They're high school athletic directors. I didn't reply to it at first because I still didn't know if it was legit or not. So that night, when she got home from her job in Shelbyville, one of the first things I did was I said, "Come here in my office, I want to show you this email. I want you to see this email and read it." And she started reading it. And she started having this big grin on her face. She said, "Oh, I know all about that." She said, "Jesse Currens, he's the athletic director at Anderson County High School, came to me back at the start of the basketball season and said he was nominating you for this and he wanted me to help." So, 2 weeks ago, when I was on the podium receiving that award, I was looking out, and I was dumbfounded, kindly. The person I was standing next to who was giving it to me was somebody I actually knew through my former life in the newspaper business. But I could look out to my left, and I could see Stephanie, and I looked like I was scared in the pictures. She was absolutely beaming. She was just beaming. I was proud and surprised, but I believe she was one who's even more proud than I was. And that's why our marriage, I believe, is strong. We aren't perfect. She annoys me. I don't annoy her at all. Uh-oh, she's coming forward now to change it. Now, we annoy each other. We're not perfect, and we do annoy each other. But we put each other's needs before our own. The only thing I ask you to do is never ask us to go out to eat with us, because if you're trying to pick it, we're never going to decide on where we're going to eat unless there's a restaurant out there say, "I don't care, you pick." You know what I'm saying here? That's our biggest thing. You see, God prepared us not for an award, but for His gift. And God took the form of a man, and what did He do? He served. So if you want a strong family, serve each other, just like Jesus. Today is Mother's Day. We recognize mothers. I joke about how many times my mother had blistered me, or she sent me to my father for an encounter with his belt. But I also know about the many times my mother sacrificed so I could go play ball, or so I could go show cattle. And I know how much my mother and my father sacrificed so I could go to college and to graduate school. If you want a strong church or strong family, serve each other. If you want a strong church, serve each other, just like Jesus. Don't worry about your own wants. If all you worry about is your own wants, you know what's going to happen? You're going to be miserable. You're going to be absolutely miserable. And you're going to make those around you miserable as well. Instead, love God, love people, love your family, love God, love people, and love the world around you If we do those things, we can change the world around us, just like Jesus. Let's go to the Lord in prayer.